Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Jag heter Henrik Möller, musiken är skriven av Testbild och den fina loggan är skapad av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om Daniel Olssons bok om Patrick McGrath, Writing Madness, och hur den anknyter till filmen Exorcisten, hur trauma påverkar minnet och i sin tur vår identitet, och Daniel Olssons egna erfarenheter som vi snart ska gå in på. Daniel Olsson är mest känd för sin imponerande 750 sidor långa bok om Stanley Kubrick och The Shining, som jag gjorde ett helt avsnitt om här i Udda Ting. Daniel har också skrivit en lika tjock bok om Guillermo del Toros filmer, The Devil's Backbone och Pan's Labyrinth, samt en om hela Exorcisten-filmsviten med fokus då på den första filmen. Samtliga av dessa böcker är utgivna av Centipede Press, men nu ska vi börja med Daniel Olssons nya bok Writing Madness. You had some first-hand accounts with madness from very early on.
I was born in the mid-60s. My mother worked at a mental asylum. Almost most of her working life, all of her working life, she was at this mental asylum. And the thing was, in my hometown, it was a big employer. It was a kind of a plum to be employed there. And so it was thought of very highly. As time has gone by, people have reappraised what they thought of this mental hospital because of some of the restraint techniques. Rights groups representing clients from mental hospitals have publicized some of the things that went on there that were bad. But at any rate, as a kid, sometimes mom could not find a babysitter for me. And so, what do? You can't leave your child at home. Your husband is away working. So she brought me along to the mental hospital. And of course, right away, there was this long interest. We're talking, I think she first brought me there before kindergarten. So we're talking about age 4. And then in the summers, when there was no school and no one to look after me, she'd bring me there too. My mom would include me on outings that the patients would take. Sometimes they go to a theater, sometimes they go to the park to do a softball game with the staff. In the summertime, we have a lot of college students taking temporary staff positions to help the clients at the mental hospital get out, while the full-time permanent workers go on vacation in the summer. I can remember this distinctly. We went out to Lum Park, right near the Mississippi River, and the young staff, young men, young women who were just out there on college break, slightly flirtatious with each other, were setting up a softball game for the patients. They were pitching to one of the patients. I was just sitting by a tree watching it. I was included. My mom thought this was healthy for me to get away from my odd books for a while and, join the bigger stream of people, be outside. I was watching the softball game. Right next to it, the staff was pitching to one of the clients, and one of the clients who was sitting by a tree ran over to where a female patient was, and he lunged at her. He just fell on her, kissing her neck. He started grinding himself into her. He started moaning. And remember, I was just almost 11, so all of this, I'd never seen anything like this before. One of the staff members went into his pickup truck and took out a big white cloth. I'd never seen anything like this. It looked at first almost like a hammock. I didn't know what it was. He takes out this big white cloth, he starts to unfold it, and he runs over to where the male patient is who had attacked the female patient. This is all happening around noon, out in the public park. So you can imagine the stir. What they do is they take the big cloth that looks like a hammock and they put it onto the male patient. And then they tie him to a tree. I wouldn't realize until I watched a movie that this was actually a straitjacket that they tied him into. So there was nothing over his head, but he was in a straitjacket, and they had a rope that went through one of the eyes of the straitjacket that tied him to one of the pine trees so they could continue playing their ball game. So he was tied to a pine tree. And I was sitting there. They went back to their ball game. Within 5 minutes, the female patient ran over to him and attacked him in much the same way he had attacked her and they have to go to the pickup truck and get another straitjacket, bind her up, tie her up to an opposing tree, and then the game continued. As the game continues, these two are yelling at each other or moaning, and it struck me as such a weird episode that in the middle of a park, in the middle of the day, where all kinds of public are, moms rolling their kids in strollers by, the beautiful lake, the beautiful water, the sun, a softball game, very haunting episode to see as a kid. I was very shaken up about it. And sometimes you see it flicker on the pages of our best dark fiction writers, scenes just like this, that I would say are almost hard to invent from the imagination. You just have to witness them and then sew them into your fiction later.
What was it about this that fascinated you, and how did it later find its way into your work?
People who were facing things that most of us don't have to face. Most of us don't think we're Abraham Lincoln or Napoleon. We don't wake up in the morning thinking these things, but some of the clients at the hospital did. So there was always a deep interest in these folks and how they could put on personas, how they'd really believe them, and it just always stayed with me. Now in college I chose to go the literature route, and I also studied world religions, so I didn't go the route of psychology, but in the back of my mind, abnormal psychology is always there. It's always the big appeal. And many of the stories that I deal with are about perspective. Is this person mad that we're reading of, or is this person really seeing a glimpse of the old ones or what the old ones have left behind? There's always that ambiguity. And in literature, there's this fascination with madness. Emily Dickinson, one of my favorite poets, says, much madness is divinest sense. Mark Twain once said, once we realize that we're all mad, then all the mysteries disappear and everything stands explained. There is a fascination with how people see things in abnormal ways, and I've always been interested in that, and much of the fiction deals with it. Now, it's only within the last 175 years or so that people who have mental disease are not considered possessed. We look at a book in a film like The Exorcist. This is a wonderful book that Centipede Press did on The Exorcist and the two prequel films and the two sequel films. It's really interesting that the mom in The Exorcist, Mrs. McNeil, she first goes to a psychologist for her girl who's got challenges, then goes to psychiatrist, then neurologist, all of these people who try to make sense of the brain, and they all tell her the same thing. There's nothing we can do for your daughter. We don't know. We don't know what's wrong with her. And the last one tapped on the list are the old magic men, the priests. Bring in the Catholic priests to try to do something with this girl. And it's curious because when we did interviews for this Exorcist book, the director still maintains, Billy Friedkin, that, maybe she's not possessed. Maybe this is you're getting much of this filtered through the view of two priests, one of whom is convinced the devil and his lieutenants are realities and not just superstition, folklore, imaginings of a troubled mind. And the second priest, Damien, who's somewhat reluctant to believe in this mumbo jumbo, but as time goes by and under the guidance of the older priest, starts believing, there is something there. So The Exorcist was a natural book for me to gravitate to because of the people I was exposed to when I was a kid who really did believe there were other people in the room, somebody you couldn't see, that sort of thing. Madness, possession, sacrifice are part of that book. And the beauty for me with a film in a book like The Exorcist is it mingles horror with something, and diabolism with something even grander. which is sacrifice of yourself for another, for an innocent little girl.
What was your initial fascination when you started out to work on this Exorcist book?
One of the things I enjoyed most is an investigator who tries to track down what was the original story that so affected the late Bill Blatty that was reported in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and the work to uncover who the original boy was who was reported to be possessed, where he lived, how the family tried to cover up traces because they did not want to be media sensations, and the fact that this investigator, as he did his work, found out that boy, who's now an adult, still does not wish to be interviewed about this experience. That was a part of the book that I think is a favorite for students. I can actually get you the title and the author right now. That this is Mark Opsasnik's work. It's called The Haunted Boy, The Inspiration for the Exorcist. It's quite a long piece. It's almost 50 pages long, but he does a patient unfolding of, and it's kind of interesting because the boy's family was Lutheran. The Lutheran minister is called in to look at the boy, and at some point he says, you know, this is a job for the Catholic Church. He just instantly bows out of this. He's not going to get involved with any kind of exorcism. It's a fascinating point where things get very ecumenical suddenly, and he says, hey, let me call my Catholic colleagues and they can help with you. So what Mark Opsasnik's work deals with is the journals that the two priests also maintained during the exorcism of the boy, which is quite fascinating. That is great. I think the other part of the book that I really enjoy looking at again, the re-released Exorcist version that had more of what Bill Blatty wanted. Friedkin makes some allowances to Bill Blatty to put in a slightly different ending, and also to have more of the chats between the priests, which try to get at what does this spirit that's infiltrated this girl's body really want? What is the goal of this possession? And the older priest, played by Max von Sydow, basically makes the case that it wants us to feel despair, disgust with ourselves, to feel animalistic. To me, that was a very interesting part of the book because it keyed in with all of the research I've done on the Gothic before. When you look at Gothic novels from The Monk, you look at one of the original Gothic novels, Castle of Otranto, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is a kind of science fiction novel, Melmoth the Wanderer. When you examine their last 50 pages or so, one of the nouns that comes up more than any other, one of the emotional states is, it's repeated the exact word again and again, is despair. In other words, what the protagonist feels most by end of each of those four novels is what the older priest says, that Pazuzu wants everyone in that household to feel. Feeling despair, feeling the pointlessness of it, feeling I can't love anyone, no one can love me, we are worse than beasts, all of us. To feel isolated from each other. This was the goal. We can have all the physical strength in the world, but once we start having any sense of meaning, or once we have a self-disgust, we are lost creatures. And despair is very much the image on the faces and the postures that I remember as a kid being taken in to Brainerd State Hospital with my mom when she couldn't find a babysitter for me. That's exactly the look that people had on their faces. And when we leave the hospital, when her shift was over, you'd see people looking outside these big glass panes with an utter hopelessness. There was nothing on the horizon for them. Now, when you see that when you're 4 or 5, and you continue to see that till about age 11, it haunts you, and you tend to look for it again in fiction. And that's where I see it in the fiction of Patrick McGrath.
Your book Writing Madness is a collection of short fiction of Patrick McGrath. How did that start?
I've always been interested in any kind of fiction that deals with someone going to an asylum, a hospital for the criminally insane, a prison that holds mentally troubled people, and that person getting some information that's needed from this distressed individual. And we, of course, see that in fiction a lot. We see people in mental hospitals that are very troubled, but they have some key information that the protagonist needs to find. We've seen this in novels like Bram Stoker's Dracula. We see it in a Lovecraft short story or two where someone is confined to a mental institution after an encounter with the sublime, an encounter with something so overwhelming, their senses are never the same. They can't go back to whatever the baseline was of normality. And another writer who's been doing this since about 1988 is the writer born in London who grew up at Broadmoor Hospital, west of London, named Patrick McGrath. You may have read some of Patrick's books before or seen them about. This was his first novel, The Grotesque, which was made into a film with Alan Bates. Alan Bates plays a quadriplegic gentleman who's the lord of the estate, and the singer Sting plays the butler, Fletch. And the gentleman who is paralyzed, we enter into his mind. He can't move, but he can interpret what's going on, and he's assuming that the butler, Fletch, is having an affair with the protagonist's wife. So that was a fascinating book, and I think it was the third book I ever taught in college literature classes, after Frankenstein and after Dracula. And literature classes loved it, especially for its dry wit, its British humor, its gallows comedy. Another book that Patrick McGrath wrote, who also is the subject of our book Writing Madness, is Asylum. This was made into a film with the late Natasha Richardson. Ian McKellen plays one of the doctors in this. This book is based on a memory that Patrick McGrath has of growing up at Broadmoor Hospital, which has long been one of Britain's more famous institutions for holding the so-called criminally insane. He remembers as a boy coming home into the parlor of his family, and all of the doctors and the spouses of the doctors hushing. They were talking about something with animation, and all of a sudden when the boy comes in real life, they hush. And he has long been interested in this idea of what were they talking about and why did they have to put a blanket over it suddenly. And in this book, he develops a case that he later discovered they were talking about. It was a case where a spouse of one of the doctors falls in love with one of the patients at Broadmoor Hospital, who was in the hospital for a case of paranoia, a case of murderous jealousy, where he kills his wife in a very fiendish way. He was a sculptor. I won't go into details because it'll be a plot spoiler, but at any rate, in real life, the mad sculptor and the wife of one of the attending physicians at Broadmoor run off. They just escape. And that's what these people in Patrick McGrath's house were all talking about. He decides to develop this into a book, treat it through the lens of fiction. It was a very interesting film. A third book that he has made that was made into a very interesting film, directed by David Cronenberg and considered by Patrick McGrath the best filmic treatment of his work yet was the film, which has the same name as its novel, called Spider. Writing a publisher, Centipede Press, we got the idea of making a beautiful edition of the collected stories. Some of these stories have appeared in volumes of his work. One volume came out in 1989, but many of them have appeared in little journals, in other anthologies, multi-author anthologies. They've never been collected in one volume. So we've got a 600-page volume of his short works, including all of his short stories today, including a Lovecraft-inspired one. One of the key interests that I have and characters have going into asylums, mental hospitals, is what new perspective do we get from the so-called insane person, from this troubled soul? How are we seeing the world differently? Proust once said, of course, the point of art is to see with new eyes, and to go into the mental institution is the ultimate experience of that. Just as reading Lovecraft stories, I think, is one of the great experiences of seeing with new eyes. So many times a character is encountering someone who saw something of the old one, something impossible, something overwhelming. And one of the things that happens in the story is the protagonist starts seeing with new eyes and is never the same. So that is one of the pulls, to basically see through the eyes of someone with this disorder, but then to be able to go back to our world. And a number of the books that I teach in memoirs class deal with someone who has a mental disorder or whose loved one does, and what that experience is like. When I teach my horror, ghosts, and gothic class, one of the issues we deal with is imprisonment. I teach some stories, for instance, including the one from Franz Kafka, that is set in a penal colony. It's called Inside the Penal Colony. It seems to be set in French Guiana, and it deals with a executioner showing off his killing device to a visitor to the penal colony, and he's very proud of the killing device. Well, I thought at some point when I was teaching this story and others that deal with imprisonment and execution and some of the very intimidating people you might meet in such a place, that in order to understand those stories better, to appreciate them, we really have to go to a place where tough people are held, sentenced to death, and then executed. So with the state's permission, I managed to take my classes to the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas, where prisoners are taken on their day to be executed to the death chamber. And the guide for our visit is a Sergeant Cardoza, who's one of the people in charge of putting restraints on the convict at the table where the convict is given 3 injections, which end up killing him or her. Student reaction is very interesting. Some of the students feel, well, these people did terrible crimes. They deserve this kind of punishment, and those students have a kind of Old Testament triumph in their eyes of eye for eye when we're actually in that death chamber, which is a very small room. Other students faint. I mean, they just fall over. Other students, including an Italian student, a student from a country that has no death penalty, she just sobbed in my arms. It's quite moving to see people's reactions to it. My own reaction is a kind of nausea, a feeling of sickness. I still found that I need to go because we have to do these things to see how art works and what separates one story about an execution from another, and what are the kind of characters in a place that execute people, and what is the warden like, and what does the execution devices, what do they look like, what do the holding cells look like. They have different holding cells for the convict about to be executed depending on his or her mental state and how hard it will be to get that person out of the cell on the evening of execution. So one thing that we all look at when we're at that prison is the look in people's eyes. The eyes tell you so much. And as we move through the prison, we see some of the convicts. I've got to talk with some of them. And it can be unexpected things can come up. This is also the prison that had the longest civilian hostage siege in American history, where civilians from the outside visiting the prison were held 11 days in August of, I believe it was 1974. This ghost of history flitters around, and you see bullet holes in the bricks from where there was a shootout between the prisoners taking civilian hostages. And who knows how it comes up in students writing later on their creative works, their poems, to be close to a place where people are every few days executed. You go to this execution chamber, it looks like a facility that was handmade by somebody. It looks like a do-it-yourself job. And when you look from where the victim is stretched out on a gurney to the glass, you see a thin piece of plywood bisects the glass. On the right side is the family of the victim that the convict killed. On the left side of a piece of plywood that's about half an inch or 3/4 inch thick, stand the family and friends of the convict about to be executed. So 3/4 inch separate these two grieving families. And that too is extremely potent. You never quite forget that. To be so close to that kind of suffering, that kind of grief, agony, and then a new killing done in the name of the state is unforgettable. It definitely stays with you. And it keeps you on the narrow and straight path. You never want to break the law after going into a place like that.
Well, that's been proven not to work, and I have a good example of this. I read about an Iranian serial killer named the Tehran Vampire, and his thing was that he would pick up victims in his taxi cab, drive them out into the countryside and attack them and set them on fire. Well, one victim escaped and he was caught. His execution was made a public one, and they had built a huge stage where the victims' families and relatives got to go up on stage and beat him one by one. And of course there were a lot of family members from all of his many victims, so they almost beat the guy to death before they finally hanged him. And I distinctly remember the detail in the text that they hanged him from a yellow crane. You might think that this would discourage other murderers. Well, I think it was less than 2 weeks before a copycat killer appeared, proudly saying, "I am the new vampire killer."
Interesting, this aspect of vengeance against the serial killer, the family being allowed to hit the body, that connects with something that was raised as I was finishing up the Guillermo del Toro book on his 2 Spanish Civil War films, The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth. Both Guillermo and his father were living in Guadalajara. His father was kidnapped, held for ransom, and it looked very bad. The famed director James Cameron of Titanic and other films helped Guillermo out. I think he gave Guillermo $1 million to help pay the ransom to get the father back. The Mexican police arrest individuals, and they contact Guillermo, and they say, "We have the individuals. For X $1,000, you can be alone in a room with them. They'll all be tied up, and we'll give you a lead pipe, and you can do whatever you want to do." Now, that is an offer to someone who has been suffering so much, who has probably been filled with both rage and despair. And Guillermo wrote he was so glad he did not take that offer. He met with other families later on who had also had loved ones taken from them and ransomed. They met at a dinner once, and some of the people at that dinner, they paid the X thousand to beat these suspects. Who knows if they really were the kidnappers or not. The Mexican police said they were, but the Mexican police say many things. At any rate, some of the people at that banquet did beat the accused kidnappers. And Guillermo said that the price to your soul, the price to your memory, the amount of trauma you get from doing that kind of violence, even if you were wronged by those people, they really were the kidnappers, let's say, in no way helps you. That brief release of anger and tension that you get from striking back is overwhelmed by these nauseous feelings of guilt, cruelty, sinking to the level of brutes. It was very interesting to hear his side of what it is to be offered revenge when you might, part of your soul might be hungry for it, and yet you're never going to be the same if you take that route. And he's so glad, he said, that he did not, even though he was burning with great tension. It stays with you. That whole story is instructive. And you see it come up in dark literature all the time, which seems very interested in revenge. And sometimes it's just a fantasy. It's a survival fantasy of somebody who's down at a time by someone else's hand, under their neck, under the boot of some victimizer. And a kind of bloody vengeance is a kind of revenge fantasy that, when the victim actually gets the chance to take it, is revealed as not solving or curing anything. Though some of the characters that we deal with do take it, they become very violent, and in the end, it doesn't really solve much. It makes us criminals all around. And that was my take on execution in Texas. It was just debasing us all the more, everyone involved with it.
When did you come in contact with Guillermo and decide to make a book about his films?
When I was doing the Exotic Gothic series, I had a publisher who was in contact with Guillermo, and they forwarded a message to him, and I wanted to include him in a book of short stories if he had any new material. He was working on a short story called Ivanka and the Little People, but he didn't get time to finish it by the time I was looking for. However, later on I said to him that I've done a couple books on films, and I think there aren't enough books on your films, and a film like Pan's Labyrinth, I think, is a giant in our time, one of my favorite films, if not the favorite. And would you be interested in a kind of scholarly treatment of this film? And he was immediately 100%. As you can tell, he's extremely busy with all these different projects, but he had time to help out with this one a great deal by supplying art, concept art for the films, by giving behind-the-scenes photographs of the actors and sets, by going over the translations in my book from Spanish to English, and also supplying footnotes. Beyond that, he does the interviews for the book. So I contacted him through a mutual friend, a publisher who both of us knew, and said, let's please do this book. And he was on board right away, supportive in every way, and very interested in the actual design, layout, artistry of the book. He really truly is an artist, no doubt about it. And I'm delighted that he said the release of this book is perfect because there is a new international traveling exhibition of my bleak house. What this exhibition has is, from his house, props from the movies, costumes from the movies, art, sketches that he's made, and then things that he's collected from great terror and horror movies over the years. So this book is sold at that exhibition in the gift shop along with other great books on his art. And it's been doing well, and it looks like it will have a second printing soon. That's how I connected with him.
So what is your take on Pan's Labyrinth?
Well, it's magic, of course. Pan's Labyrinth, this vision of the Pale Man, of Pan, of another realm. It's a girl's fantasy, or it is what a dying mind gives you to comfort as she is slipping away after being shot by her stepfather. My argument is that is the limited, harshly realistic side in us speaking, somewhat jaded and unimaginative. My argument is there was another realm. She encounters it. She's open to it. And in fact, if there was another realm, it helps explain some things in the story that we otherwise cannot. There is the presence of an ancient book of crossroads in this story. Now, there's no evidence this girl could get the book from anywhere else. She only comes to this mill that her stepfather has in his effort to wipe out the Maquis resistance fighters. She only has to bring with her some comic books, some fairy tales, nothing like this book of crossroads. How could she get it? There's a point also in the movie where Captain Vidal picks up a piece of chalk and he looks at it with wonder, like, we have no chalk here. How did this chalk get here? I asked the actress, Ivana Baquero, who plays little Ophelia, well, what is your take on this? Many viewers and critics have pondered long over whether Ophelia's potent imagination only creates the fabulous creatures, or if they did have some independent existence and agency and entered her space. In your mind now, do you sense that there was no fantasy world and Ophelia created it as a comfort, as a mind creates a beautiful wish fulfillment upon dying? Or was there a fantasy world for those who know where to look, as real as the grim real one of fascist captains, of pistols, bombs, and dead civilians? Ivana Baquero's answer is, that is indeed one of the big enigmas about Pan's Labyrinth. And Guillermo purposefully did it that way so as to leave an open door for the viewer. He wanted people to have their own opinion about it. Thus, there was no right or wrong. It's all a matter of your personal perspective and what you choose to believe. And for me, this ending is one of the beauties of the film because it leaves it up to you. She doesn't simplify. She doesn't make it pat or obvious. She says the ending is still what you bring yourself to this film. And may it mean something different on your next viewing.
Did you ask Guillermo if he was inspired by Arthur Machen, and in particular his story, The White People?
In the interview that I did with him, it was more on Spanish history. But one of the interviews that we considered with the book asked him for a lot of the literary sources. And Machen comes up, the great god Pan comes up, and so do a number of other stories by British writers.
I always had, and some of my friends too, had a problem with the creature of Pan in this story. He's nothing like the myth of the great god Pan.
Pan, in the title Pan's Labyrinth, is a somewhat unfortunate choice, pushed more because of marketing reasons than anything. In the Spanish original, of course, it's El Laberinto del Fauno, the Faun's Labyrinth. His point was this: Pan is too potent of a deity for any of these mortals to withstand. It would obliterate them. In English, it's for some reason, for marketing reasons, it sounded better to have Pan's Labyrinth than the Faun's Labyrinth.
Very interesting. That certainly shed some light on that. Och med de orden så var det slut för den här gången. Jag heter Henrik Möller. Musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då.